Hey guys, welcome back. So for today's video, we're going to do an instructional video on our ice block axle carriers, as well as a deep dive into their design. Up to this point, we just had a very brief, here's how you install them video, but I answer a lot of questions from emails of clients asking, what about this, what about that, what are the different height positions? So to that end, I wanted to shoot this video, give a much more in-depth instructional installation how-to, as well as a deeper dive into the function of the ice block axle carriers. So when you order the axle carriers, you'll notice they come in this box. You pop the box open, and that's the way they're displayed inside. You'll also get an instructional sheet and some stickers as well. Now, these carriers come, there are numerous parts that are pre-assembled in the box. You will eventually be disassembling them to install them, but I wanted to walk through. You receive 12 titanium screws, 2 mounting plates, an axle shim, and the 2 ice blocks themselves, which are an axle carrier body and a removable C-shaped clamping component, which is held on with its own 2 screws here. When you pull the ice blocks out of the package, again, they're pre-assembled. Make note of the way they're assembled so that as you're installing them, you can get a good idea of the orientation of each of the screws on the axle carriers. I would like to address this shim. This is an important item. Our axle carriers are designed to be used with the stock GT or GTS wheel that would come with your board, but also they can be used for those that have an XR wheel from a couple of years back that they had modified to work on the GT platform. In only that circumstance, this shim gets moved from one carrier to the next. So for 99% of customers that are buying these and installing them, you will take the motor wire side carrier, which has this slot in it. The other carrier does not have that slot. This slot is for the motor wire. This shim gets used on this motor side axle carrier. It gets dropped into the axle carrier to space the end of the axle away from the axle carrier, this 3 millimeters thickness of this shim. Only in the application where you're using an older XR wheel being installed on a GT or GTS, this spacer gets moved to the other side carrier. However, very, very few people do that. So for nearly everybody watching this video, this shim gets put on the motor wire side axle carrier. First, you'll be installing the carriers onto the wheel. Then you'll install the entire wheel assembly with the carrier installed onto the frame rail. However, I do think it's helpful for me to walk through the system of the way the carriers mount to the frame rail first, so you can get an idea of the height adjustment and the way the internal structure of the carriers work within the frame rail, just in a more convenient layout. Now, the original mounting method for the stock wheel with the stock rails are long bolts that go through the rail, through axle carrier spacers, and right into the axle. Our axle carriers are very different from that. What you would do with the ice blocks is you start with this mounting plate. This mounting plate will get screwed to the frame rail. Now, here's where it gets interesting. You have to choose what height position you want the axle carriers to be on before you mount this plate to the rail. The reason for that is that these height adjustment screws get captured between this mount plate and the rail, and therefore you cannot access the head of the screws. So when you're using the stock rails or other manufacturers' rails, WTF rails or Lightning rails, you're going to have to pull a frame rail off in order to change the height position of the axle carriers. It's different with our rails, and I'll get to that in a moment. But for those of you installing these carriers on any rails other than our proprietary rail system, you're going to need to pre-assemble the axle carrier at the height position you want, then install it onto the rail. And I'll show you how to do that. So you would start with the axle carrier body, and then you've got the mount plate. Now this mount plate can mount in either orientation. The reason for that is within the frame rail, you'll notice there's this gap here. People have asked, why don't we fill the entire rail with this plate? That gap is to allow the controller to battery wire, the harness lead, to run through that section. So when you install this plate, you have that gap there, so the wire can run through it, and then the body of the axle carrier will capture over that, and now you have that wire run in a protected zone. Now you can indeed flip this plate over and have even more height position adjustment, and at that point you would merely run the harness lead in that gap above the mount plate. So that's the reason for the narrower mount plate. Now on the axle carriers themselves, you have a center position, and then you have 2 heights up and 2 heights down. So you end up with 5 positions total in 1/2 inch increments. So you end up with centered and then 1 inch raise or 1/2 inch raise. Same thing with drop. You have a full 1 inch drop or a 1/2 inch drop. So again, center, 1/2 or 1 inch, center, 1/2 or 1 inch in the other direction. So what you would do is take this plate, mount it in the height position you would like, and as a side note, one convenient way to judge how you are setting this position is to merely lay the rail over the axle carrier body, and then you can sight across the rail to see, well, is the axle carrier raised or lowered or centered on the rail? Because we don't have any markings on the carrier body to denote are you raising or lowering it. So I always tell people to give just a rough layout on the table and lay the frame rail over it and just sight down, and you can get an idea of are you raising or lowering it. That seems to be the easiest method to set that height within the rail. So you would take your axle carrier, install your height adjustment screws, and you would snug those down. And then at that point, the axle carrier is set at its height position. Then you would place the axle carrier within the frame rail and then install the wide, stubby axle bolts. Onto the rail. So that's the rail portion of the installation. All right, now that you guys understand the way the axle carriers themselves mount to the frame rails, the reasoning behind the design, we'll go ahead and walk you through the process of installing the carriers onto the wheel and then installing the completed assembly onto a frame rail. And I'm going to point out a few features of these carriers in the installation process, because you're going to have questions as far as why did we do things the way we did versus the stock carriers. So I would like you to start with the motor wire side carrier. Step 1, you'll be taking 4mm Allen wrench, and you'll remove this C-shaped clamping component off of the axle body, or the axle carrier body. Remove that, set it aside. And now you're going to want to take your 3mm thick shim or spacer, place that within the axle carrier itself. And you will notice that now the axle is oriented with the screw holes over the top of one another rather than in this orientation. The factory has the axle positioned in this orientation on the frame rail. That makes the wire exit the bottom of the axle, and it affixes the axle to the rail in a manner which is less than ideal for the strength of the axle. What we've found is, if you rotate the axle at 90 degrees, there are numerous benefits. Benefit number one, it's far stronger. These axles are hollow, but this area where the screws are is a very thick boss of material that goes all the way through the axle. And when you rotate at 90, you have that leverage force being taken on those thick bosses on the axle rather than on the thin walls that it would be taken when the wheel is in, or the axle is in this orientation. So that's item number one, is that you'll notice the axle rotates 90 degrees. That gives strength, but what it also does is it takes the wire from exiting the bottom of the axle to now exiting in this direction, and that actually gives you almost a ½ inch or somewhere around 9 or 10 millimeters of added wire length. So now if you want to run extra long rails or rails with steep angles to them, and you find that the wire is somewhat snug with the wheel in the stock orientation, now with the axle rotated at 90, you end up with much more wire to work with. So you've got your shim in the axle carrier itself. And what you'll do is feed the motor wire through this slot and put the carrier over the axle. And you can see that the wire will lay within that slot. Now you'll have to back that up just a touch to install this C-shaped clip or C-shaped clamp. So you'll wrap that around the axle. Use your 4mm Allen wrench here. You don't want to snug those down, just loosely install them in the holes. Slide the axle carrier down until it stops in its hole. Now you want to use, these are the longest screws in the kit. These go through the axle carrier body, through that shim, and into the axle itself. And you want to go and snug these down real nice and firm. Once you've got those snugged down, you can go back with your 4mm Allen wrench and snug down these clamping screws that clamp around the axle. Now, I'll go ahead and explain why the carriers clamp to the axle. There's numerous reasons for that. Reason number one, it adds more rotational strength between the carrier and the axle to reduce the chances of the inner axle bolts loosening up. Item number two, that clamping force around the axle from the axle carrier to the axle increases rigidity, or the tendency of the carriers to want to rock on the face of the axle. And you can actually feel it somewhat in riding the board. You feel there's this added firmness to the board itself while you're riding because of the fact that they clamp around the axle. Item number three, which might be the most important one, is that our carriers have fins machined into them. Now that's not for looks, that is to make these into heat sinks, to radiate heat off of the electric motor. The heat comes through the axle and it's shed from the axle into the frame rails. So our carriers clamp to the axle with a lot of surface area, and that pulls heat from the center of the motor into the axle carrier where it's shed through the fins. So those are the reasons why our carriers clamp around the axle. So now once you've got that carrier mounted to the axle itself, you would tuck the wire in, and you're going to want to go ahead and install the height adjustment plate. So choose the height position that you want, and then go ahead and install it. You'll notice that the motor wire actually gets captured by this plate. Once that plate is installed, you can see that the wire exits through between the plate and the carrier body. That gives a huge amount of protection to that wire. In the stock orientation, with it coming out the bottom, the factory does put a plastic retainer there. However, if that retainer is missing, the wire is then exposed and can get hit pretty easily and damaged. But in our case, it's captured between this mount plate and the carrier body. Now, once you have that installed, you would go ahead and take your frame rail and lay the frame rail over the axle carrier, line up the holes, and go ahead and install these thick, stubby outer axle bolts. Go ahead and snug that down. And there you've got a completed installation onto one of the frame rails. The other side is the same, but actually easier because you're not, in the other side rail, you're not running the motor wire through. So it's a much simpler process. Now that you see the way they get installed onto the stock frame rails, I wanted to go ahead and point out our proprietary height adjustment system in our rails. Now, as I pointed out with the stock GT rails, in order to change the height position, you have to remove a frame rail to access the height adjustment holes within the mount plate. On our frame rails, we have machined a relief in the side there, which allows access to those height adjustment screws. So you can go ahead and pull those screws out and adjust the height to any position you would like. When using our frame rails along with these Ice-Block axle carriers, it allows you to drop the entire wheel and carrier assembly right out of the rails much more easily because you can remove those screws and the thickness of that mount plate is even with the lip of the rail. So once you remove the height adjustment screws on both sides, the entire wheel assembly will drop down out of the bottom. This makes maintenance much easier. One other thing to point out from a height adjustment standpoint, I mentioned earlier in the video that the Ice-Blocks have 5 positions, height positions, in half-inch increments. Our frame rails also have 2 positions, and they are 0.6 of an inch, 0.6 inches of difference between the two. So now between these, the hole positions in the rails and all of the carrier positions, you end up with 10 different height positions, but you can move in 0.1 inch increments. The reason that I say that is there are 0.6 of an inch, 0.6 inches of difference between these two holes. So if you move the carrier, say, to the lower hole, suddenly all 5 of those positions are 0.1 inch different than in the top row. They're 0.6 inch lower, but also, again, you've got that 0.1 inch difference between ½ inch of height adjustment ability in the carriers themselves, but 0.6 of an inch of difference in the frame rail. This was something that was important to us, that we didn't duplicate height positions. We didn't want to put the height position change different orientations in the rail at a ½ inch difference in position, because that means that we're just duplicating other positions within the axle carriers. But as they are, with a 0.6 inch different height, you now have that 1/10 of an inch difference in range of motion, a range of movement between the two holes. You'll see what I mean as you begin experimenting with this. If you own a set of our rails, these happen to be 357 rails. The board here has the same design, but in the 007 angle orientation. You'll find that it's the perfect combination using our rails with our Ice-Block axle carriers. But again, as I mentioned earlier in the video, the Ice-Blocks will work with the stock rails or with WTF rails, Lightning rails, pretty much anything on the market. So I think that concludes for today. I know that this is a bit complicated. It may seem a little bit confusing because the system is so incredibly different between our Ice-Blocks versus the stock mounting system. But once you've installed them and you've worked with them a little bit, you'll find that they're actually much easier to work with. The board is more serviceable. It will cool better. It's stronger. You have more wire length. There are a lot of benefits to using these. So thanks for tuning in, guys. I really appreciate it. And keep your eye out. We have a couple more videos coming soon. Deep dive into other upgrades that we make, as well as some future products that we have in the works. Thanks a lot.